Portland and Oregon. Part 1.
Table of Contents, Portland and Oregon. Part 1.
All about Portland and the nearby regions of Oregon and Washington. With visiting and touring information, geography, history, attractions, and other points of interest.
Dr. Sydney Soclof. Dr. Sydney 22 at gmail.com. 2023. Narration by Dr. Sydney Soclof,
Zoe Phonemes,
and Nathan Koltove. For a complete discussion of YouTube navigation, please go to tiny.1/ytnavigator. Portland, City of Roses.
This is Portland.
This is Portland.
This is Portland.
This is Portland.
Portland, City of Roses.
This is a view of Portland and the Willamette River.
This is Portland with Mount Hood in the background.
Portland is the largest city in the state of Oregon.
Here are the neighboring states of Washington, Idaho, Nevada, and California. These are the largest cities in Oregon. Oregon has a population of 4.3 million.
The largest universities in Oregon are the University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon State University in Corvallis, and Portland State University.
These are the largest cities in the state of Oregon. This is the population of the 10 largest cities in Oregon. The beautiful Oregon coast represents one of the state's top tourist attractions. These are cities along the Coast Highway US 101.
Crater Lake is one of the 3 top tourist attractions in Oregon besides the Oregon coast and the Columbia River Gorge, including Multnomah Falls.
This is a Crater Lake license plate.
The northern part of Portland borders the Columbia River. The Columbia River is the 4th largest river in the United States, dividing Oregon from Washington state. Portland is about 70 miles from the Pacific Ocean.
Portland is located along the Willamette River, near the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia Rivers.
Although Portland is a port for ocean-going vessels, it is 100 miles or 160 kilometers by river from the Pacific Ocean.
The confluence of the Willamette River with the Columbia River is about 10 miles or 16 kilometers north of downtown Portland.
This shows the Portland metropolitan area, including Vancouver, Washington, on the north side of the Columbia River. Here looking south is Portland straddling the Willamette River. Here again is the Portland metropolitan area, with the city limits shown, and also including Vancouver, on the north side of the Columbia. Note that the city limits do extend up to the Columbia River.
The major suburbs of Portland are Gresham, Happy Valley, Milwaukee, Lake Oswego, Tigard, Beaverton, and Hillsborough. Here is an overview of the Portland-Vancouver metropolitan area. Note you South Highway 30 going east-west through Portland. It continues to Astoria ending at Highway 101 at the bridge.
In the other direction, Highway 30 goes through the Columbia River Gorge as the old historic highway, and then across the country to the Atlantic Ocean at Atlantic City, New Jersey, a distance of 3,073 miles.
It has existed since 1926, and the part of it in the east is known as the Lincoln Highway. This is a view of the Portland-Vancouver area near the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia rivers. These are the counties of Oregon.
Portland is the seat of Multnomah County, and the metropolitan area extends over the tri-county area of Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington counties.
Portland has 620,000 inhabitants, making it the 28th most populous city in the United States. Approximately 3 million people live in the Portland metropolitan area, which ranks 17th in the U.S. Roughly 60% of Oregon's population resides within the Portland metropolitan area.
Portland is located 70 miles east of the Pacific Ocean at the northern end of Oregon's most populated region, the Willamette Valley.
This is the Willamette Valley. The Willamette River is a major tributary of the Columbia River and is one of the few northward flowing rivers in the U.S. The Willamette Valley starts in the region of Eugene and Springfield and extends northward about 100 miles or 160 kilometers to the Columbia River.
The Willamette Valley is bordered on the west by the Coast Range and on the east by the much higher Cascade Range.
The Oregon Coast Range averages around 1,500 feet, 460 meters, in elevation above sea level, whereas peaks in the Cascade Mountains are around 10,000 feet, 6,000 meters, high.
The Willamette Valley is bordered on the south by the Siskiyou Mountains, which extend down into California.
The Cascade Range stretches northward for more than 700 miles, 1,100 kilometers, from Lassen Peak, in Northern California, through Oregon and Washington to the Fraser River in southern British Columbia. Many peaks exceed 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters. The highest peak in the Cascades is Mount Rainier in Washington, at 14,411 feet, 4,392 meters.
The tallest point in Oregon is Mount Hood, at 11,235 feet or 3,424 meters. On clear days, Mount Hood is easily visible from Portland at a distance of 48 miles or 77 kilometers.
About 2/3 of the population of Oregon, including Portland and the state capital at Salem, live in the Willamette Valley. It is also a very rich agricultural region. The Willamette River is a major tributary of the Columbia River, contributes 12 to 15% of the total flow, and is second only to the Snake River.
Downtown Portland straddles the banks of the Willamette River, which flows north through the city center and consequently separates the east and west neighborhoods of the city.
Most of the downtown area is west of the Willamette River.
This shows the Willamette River flowing through the center of Portland.
Though much of downtown Portland is relatively flat, the foothills of the Tualatin Mountains, more commonly referred to locally as the West Hills, go through the northwest and southwest parts of the city. The tallest point within city limits is located in the West Hills and has an elevation of 1,073 feet.
The highest point east of the river is Mount Tabor, an extinct volcanic cinder cone, which rises to 636 feet.
To the west of Portland is the Oregon Coast Range, and to the east lies the actively volcanic Cascade Range. On clear days, Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens dominate the horizon. Mount St. Helens, a highly active volcano 50 miles northeast of Portland in Washington. It is easily visible on clear days and is close enough to have dusted the city with volcanic ash after its eruption on May 18, 1980.
Portland lies on top of an extinct volcanic field known as the Boring Lava Field, which contains at least 32 cinder cones, including Mount Tabor, and its center lies in southeast Portland.
The Portland metropolitan area, including suburbs, is one of the few places in the continental United States to have extinct volcanoes within the city's limits. Bend, Oregon is another place with an extinct volcano within the city. Pilot Butte is a 500-foot-high cinder cone located within the city limits.
Cityscape and Bridges.
Portland's cityscape derives much of its character from the 17 bridges that span the Willamette River downtown. Several of these bridges are historic landmarks, and Portland has been nicknamed Bridgetown for many decades.
3 of downtown's most heavily utilized bridges are more than 100 years old and are designated historic landmarks. They are the Hawthorne Bridge, 1910. The Steel Bridge, built in 1912.
And the Broadway Bridge, built in 1913. Portland's newest bridge, Tillicum Crossing, opened in 2015, and is the first new bridge to open in Portland since the 1973 opening of the Fremont Bridge.
The Willamette River, which flows north through downtown, serves as the natural boundary between East and West Portland. The
denser and earlier developed west side extends into the West Hills, while the flatter east side fans out for roughly 180 blocks until it meets the suburb of Gresham.
The 5 quadrants of Portland have developed distinctive identities of the time, with mild cultural differences and friendly rivalries between their residents, especially between those who live east of the Willamette River and west of the river.
The official quadrants of Portland are north, northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast, with downtown Portland in the southwest quadrant.
The Willamette River divides the east and west quadrants of the city, while Burnside Street, which traverses the entire city lengthwise, divides the north and south quadrants.
All addresses within the city are denoted as belonging to one of these specific quadrants with the prefixes north, northwest, northeast, southwest, or southeast.
Downtown Portland. This is downtown Portland with some points of interest shown. Many of Portland's points of interest are in this central area. The Northwest Portland quadrant, primarily occupied by warehouses, light industry, and railroad classification yards in the early mid-20th century, now houses upscale art galleries, restaurants, and retail stores, and is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. Areas further west of the Pearl District include neighborhoods known as Uptown and Nob Hill, as well as the Alphabet District in Northwest 23rd Avenue, a major shopping street lined with expensive clothing boutiques and other upscale retail, mixed with cafes and restaurants.
Northeast Portland is home to the Alberta Arts District and the Hollywood District.
The northernmost area of the city, known simply as North Portland, is also primarily residential. It contains the St. John's neighborhood, which is historically one of the most ethnically diverse and poorest neighborhoods in the city.
Chinatown and Old Town are located adjacent to the Pearl District in Northwest Portland.
While Southwest Portland consists largely of the downtown district, made up of commercial businesses, museums, skyscrapers, and public landmarks, Southeast Portland is mainly residential. It consists of the Hawthorne District, Belmont, Brooklyn, and Mount Tabor.
The history of Portland and the Pacific Northwest.
We will begin the history of Portland and, in a larger sense, that of Oregon and the entire Pacific Northwest with the westward expansion of the country beyond the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean.
Key events are the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the Lewis and Clark Expedition of 1803 to 1805, the discovery of South Pass across the Rocky Mountains in 1812, and the Oregon Trail from 1836 until the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869. Before American pioneers began arriving in the 1800s, the land that eventually became Portland and surrounding Multnomah County was inhabited for many centuries by bands of the Chinook people.
Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, in 1805, first documented the Chinook people occupying the land, which would become Portland.
Before its European settlement, the Portland region of the Lower Columbia River and Willamette River valleys had been one of the most densely populated regions on the Pacific coast.
The Indians that Sacagawea and the Corps of Discovery met on the other side of the Celilo Falls were different from the Indians they had met before.
One of the tribes was the Multnomah, a tribe of the Chinook Indians, who were also known as the Flatheads for the way they shaped their babies' heads on a cradle board to make their foreheads slope toward the back of their heads. They tied their babies to a flat board, with another piece of wood fixed across the baby's brow that put pressure on the skull to flatten it from the crown to the nose. This feature was respected and seen as a beauty feature.
The Multnomah lived in cedar log houses 30 yards long and a dozen yards wide. Each family had its own entrance and feed pit.
Westward Expansion. The original 13 colonies were confined to a strip along the Atlantic coast, between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains.
After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, the empty territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, known as the Northwest Territory, was opened for settlement. People looking for new and free land spread into this area.
The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 almost doubled the area of the United States with the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory from west of the Mississippi River. to the Rocky Mountains, and from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. West of the Rocky Mountains, the land was claimed by Spain in the southwest and Britain in the northwest.
This area west of the Mississippi River was soon flooded with Americans hungry for land, especially in the present-day states of Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas.
But in the mid-1800s, new land became scarce, so people started to look westward once again, now towards Oregon country and California. This westward migration, starting in 1830, was spurred by the prospect of the fertile and free agricultural lands of the Central Valley of California, and the Willamette Valley of Oregon, and then the discovery of gold in California.
This westward migration, starting in 1830, was spurred by the prospect of the fertile and free agricultural lands of the Central Valley of California and the Willamette Valley of Oregon, and then the discovery of gold in California.
This was called the Oregon Country by the Americans and the Columbia District by the British. South of that was the Mexican territory of Alta California. The British presence in the region was generally administered by the Hudson's Bay Company, whose Columbia Department comprised most of the Oregon Country and extended considerably north into New Caledonia and beyond 54 degrees 40' north, with operations reaching tributaries of the Yukon River.
The Hudson's Bay Company was a full trading company incorporated by an English royal charter in 1670. It functioned as the de facto government in large parts of North America before European states, and later the United States laid claim to some of those territories. The Hudson's Bay Company was at one time the largest landowner in the world, with the Hudson Bay watershed, known as Rupert's Land, comprising 1/7 of the total area of North America.
The Hudson's Bay Company controlled the fur trade throughout much of North America for several centuries. Undertaking early exploration, its traders and trappers forged early relationships with many groups of Aboriginal peoples. The Hudson's Bay Company's network of trading posts formed the nucleus for later official authority in many areas of Western Canada and the United States, including its Columbia District, called by the Americans the Oregon Country. Oregon Country was a portion of land between the Pacific Ocean and the Rocky Mountains in the northwest portion of the present-day United States. In 1818, the United States and Britain agreed to a joint occupation of Oregon, allowing citizens of both countries to settle there.
Fort Vancouver.
In 1825, Dr. John McLaughlin established Fort Vancouver, near the present-day city of Vancouver, Washington, on the banks of the Columbia as a fur trading headquarters for the Hudson's Bay Company's Columbia District.
Fort Vancouver was by far the largest European settlement in the Northwest at the time. Every year ships came from London via the Pacific Ocean to deliver supplies and trade goods in exchange for furs.
The fort became the last stop on the Oregon Trail to buy supplies and land before settlers began their homestead. Because of its access to the Columbia River, Fort Vancouver's influence reached from Alaska to California and from the Rocky Mountains to the Hawaiian Islands. In 1843, the Hudson's Bay Company, in the face of increasing U.S. settlement, moved their base of operations in the region to Fort Camuson, now known as Fort Victoria, in what is now Victoria, British Columbia. In 1846 the Treaty of Oregon was ratified, and Fort Vancouver became part of the Oregon Territory of the United States. The treaty permitted the Hudson's Bay Company to continue to operate the Fort Vancouver site, even after the boundary dispute was settled, but they eventually abandoned the post in 1860.
In 1849, the United States Army constructed barracks adjacent to the British trading post and took over the Hudson's Bay facility when it was abandoned. A fee destroyed the fort itself in 1866. But the Army facility has continued in operation in various forms down to the present.
Dr. John McLaughlin, 1784 to 1857, was a chief factor and superintendent of the Columbia District of the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Vancouver from 1824 to 1845.
McLaughlin was later known as the Fatha of Oregon for his role in assisting the American cause in the Oregon Country in the Pacific Northwest in the late 1840s. His general store in Oregon City was famous as the last stop on the Oregon Trail.
The Fort Vancouver National Historic Site consists of two units. One located on the site of Fort Vancouver in modern-day Vancouver. The other unit is the former residence of John McLaughlin in Oregon City, Oregon.
The two sites were separately given National Historic designation in the 1940s. The Fort Vancouver unit was designated a National Historic Site in 1961 and was combined with the McLaughlin House in 2003.
This shows the location of the Fort Vancouver National Historic Site. The Oregon Trail.
It was the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1803 to 1805, followed by a few American fur trappers, and then by the emigration of many thousands of Americans over the Oregon Trail in the period 1840 to 1869.
That secured the claim by the U.S. to the Pacific Northwest and the area that was to become the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho.
Many pioneer settlers began arriving in the Willamette Valley in the 1830s via the Oregon Trail, primarily in the region around Oregon City, just south of present-day Portland. The Oregon Trail is a 2,200-mile, 3,500 kilometers, historic east-west wagon route and immigrant trail that connected the Missouri River to valleys in Oregon. The eastern part of the Oregon Trail spanned part of the future state of Kansas, and nearly all of what are now the states of Nebraska and Wyoming. The western half of the trail spanned most of the future states of Idaho and Oregon. In 1810, fur entrepreneur John Jacob Astor organized an expedition of frontiersmen to head westward and establish a trading post for his American Fur Company in Oregon.
The frontiersmen and another group that had sailed by ship established Fort Astoria in 1812 near the mouth of the Columbia River.
Fort Astoria was the first American-owned settlement on the Pacific coast. Astor's company hoped this would become the major post to conduct trade with China. The British took over Fort Astoria in 1813 during the War of 1812. And Astor then sold it to the Northwest Company, a rival of the Hudson's Bay Company, the dominant fur traders in the Northwest and Canada.
The British took over Fort Astoria in 1813 during the War of 1812, and Astor then sold it to the Northwest Company, a rival of the Hudson's Bay Company. the dominant fur traders in the Northwest and Canada. Fort Astoria was then renamed Fort George in honor of King George III.
Fort George became an important port of call for the maritime fur trade. In 1821, the Northwest Company was merged into the Hudson's Bay Company, which took ownership of the fort. Fort George was the company's main depot in the region until Fort Vancouver was completed in 1825 and was then abandoned.
Astor's expedition, in need of supplies and help, sent members back east in 1812.
During the journey, Robert Stewart and his companions discovered the South Pass in southwestern Wyoming, a 20-mile, 32 kilometers, gap in the Rocky Mountains that offered the lowest and easiest crossing of the Continental Divide. Lewis and Clark had crossed the divide at a more treacherous spot farther to the north and had been unaware of the pass.
Had the Lewis and Clark expedition known about the South Pass, it might have shortened their journey by many months and made it much easier.
The South Pass is the almost imperceptible crest of the Rocky Mountain chain, and across the Continental Divide, 7,550 feet, 2,300 meters, in elevation that made possible the passage of the wagon trains heading west. The South Pass remained largely ignored despite Stewart's detailed account of the Astor expedition.
In 1806, Zebulon Montgomery Pike, after exploring the Great Plains region, had famously called the West the Great American Desert. For some years thereafter, an American public that initially had been excited by the reports of Lewis and Clark became swayed against the West.
When the trappers Jedediah Smith and Thomas Fitzpatrick rediscovered the South Pass in 1824, this critical route through the mountains became widely known. The Oregon Trail was laid by fur trappers and traders from about 1811 to 1840 and was only passable on foot or by horseback. By 1836, when the first migrant wagon train was organized in Independence, Missouri, a wagon trail had been cleared to Fort Hall.
Wagon trails were cleared further and further west, eventually reaching all the way to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. What came to be called the Oregon Trail was complete, even as improved roads, cutoffs, ferries and bridges made the trip faster and safer almost every year.
From various starting points in Missouri, Iowa, or Nebraska Territory, the routes converged along the lower Platte River Valley near Fort Kearny, Nebraska Territory, and led to rich farmlands west of the Rocky Mountains.
These trails used the same route as the Oregon Trail westward across the Rockies at South Pass in present-day Wyoming.
It was the discovery of the South Pass that provided a direct route across the Continental Divide with a relatively easy grade that made possible the immigration of some 500,000 Americans to the Pacific Northwest and California.
Without the South Pass, it is almost certain that the Pacific Northwest would have been permanently claimed by the British, and the southern part of the continent would have remained part of Mexico. From the early to mid-1830s, and mainly through the years 1846 to 1869, the Oregon Trail and its many offshoots were used by about 400,000 settlers, ranchers, farmers, miners, and businessmen and their families.
The eastern half of the trail was also used by travelers on the California Trail, from 1843, and the Mormon Trail, from 1847, before turning off to their separate destinations.
The first missionary group to the west was led by Jason Lee. He left Independence, Missouri in 1834 and joined a party headed by New England merchant Nathaniel Wyeth.
The Wyeth-Lee Party was the first group to travel the entire course of what was to become the Oregon Trail. Among the most important pioneers to the Northwest was Marcus Whitman, a physician who had become a congregational missionary. In the mid-1830s, he and fellow missionary Henry Harmon Spaulding established missions in the Oregon country. Whitman established missions among the Cayuse Indians near present-day Walla Walla, Washington, and Spaulding among the Nez Perce near present-day Lewiston, Idaho.
Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spaulding, the wives of the two men, accompanied them on their journey, thus becoming the first white women to cross the South Pass and the Continental Divide.
By then, interest in the East for the Oregon country had begun to grow. In 1840, Robert Newell and Joseph Meek, leading a small party out from Fort Hall and guided by mountain man Thomas Fitzpatrick, became the first emigrants to reach the Willamette Valley by land. This is a map of the Old Oregon Trail from 1852 to 1906 by Ezra Meeker. In 1841, the Bartleson-Bidwell Party was the first wagon trail to use the entire Oregon Trail to the Columbia River.
In 1842, the second group, led by Elijah White, made the journey. Almost all of the settlers made it to the Willamette Valley in Oregon.
The original idea was to have as many United States citizens as possible settle the area, and to drive the British Hudson's Bay Company out of the disputed land.
In the winter of 1842 to 1843, Whitman made a remarkable 3,000-mile, 4,800 kilometers journey back east on horseback to persuade his sponsors to continue supporting the missions. He also conferred with federal officials in Washington, D.C. about settlement in Oregon. Those discussions became a major factor in convincing Easterners to move to the lands beyond the Rocky Mountains.
The final inspiration was supplied by the glowing reports of the region from mapmaker and explorer John C. Fremont, who famously explored the West with guides Kit Carson and Thomas Fitzpatrick in the mid-1840s and did much to dispel the myth of the Great American Desert.
The Great Migration of 1843 was led by a former U.S. Army captain, infiltrator, John Gant. It had an estimated 1,000 immigrants with over 100 wagons and 5,000 head of cattle and included the missionary Marcus Whitman, who was returning to Oregon. The Whitman Mission was founded in 1836 by Dr. Marcus Whitman and his wife, Narcissa. It was the site of one of the worst tragedies along the Oregon Trail.
The Whitmans were Methodist missionaries who offered religious instruction and medical services to the local Cayuse Indians.
The Whitman Mission National Historic Site is a United States National Historic Site located just west of Walla Walla, Washington, at the site of the former Whitman Mission. On November 29, 1847, Dr. Marcus Whitman, his wife Narcissa Whitman, and 11 others were slain by Native Americans of the Cayuse tribe. The site commemorates the Whitmans, their role in establishing the Oregon Trail, and the challenges encountered when two cultures meet.
The Whitmans also gave care and supplies to wagon parties traveling along the Oregon Trail.
This is a painting of the Whitman mission as it may have looked in the 1840s. Painted by William Henry Jackson in 1930. It is part of the collection at the Oregon Trail Museum at Scotts Bluff National Monument.
The Whitman mission became an important stop along the Oregon Trail from 1843 to 1847. And the increased number of passing immigrants added to the tension between the Whitmans and the Cayuse.
With the influx of white settlers, the Cayuse became suspicious of the Whitmans, fearing that the white man was coming to take the land.
A measles outbreak in November 1847 killed half the local Cayuse. Some of the Cayuse blamed the devastation of their tribe on Dr. Whitman and Mrs. Whitman.
The Whitmans we killed along with 11 others, and the mission was burned down. The deaths of the Whitmans shocked the country, prompting Congress to make Oregon a U.S. territory, and precipitated the Cayuse War.
The historic site was established in 1936 as the Whitman National Monument and designated a National Historic Site in 1963. A memorial obelisk erected 50 years after the massacre stands on a nearby hill.
Only a small number of Euro-Americans resided in Oregon country from 1810 through the 1830s. And these mainly were for trappers and missionaries who lived alongside native tribes. But by the 1840s, government support of Western expansion spurred migration into Oregon Territory. To encourage settlement, Congress passed the Distribution Preemption Act of 1841, recognizing squatters' rights and allowing settlers to claim 160 acres of land in the new territory.
After residing on the property for 14 months, a claimant could purchase 160 acres for $1.25 an acre. The United States government hoped to establish a strong claim of settlement in Oregon country, which at that time was held jointly by the United States and Great Britain. The Donation Land Claim Act of 1850 created a powerful incentive for settlement of the Oregon Territory, by offering 320 acres at no charge to qualifying adult U.S. citizens, 640 acres to married couples, who occupy their claims for 4 consecutive years.
This image shows a certificate issued on March 8, 1866. That grants 640 acres of land in Clackamas County to Thomas J. Chase and his wife, Nancy. The document cites the Donation Land Act of 1850 as the basis for the United States General Land Office patent. The Donation Land Claim Act of 1850, signed into law by President Millard Fillmore, drew settlers to Oregon by the thousands. By the time the act expired in 1855, settlers in Oregon had filed 7,437 patents that covered more than 2,500,000 acres of land.
This map shows the Oregon Trail and alternate routes. One of the most important alternate routes was the Barlow Road around Mount Hood and bypassing a difficult section of the Columbia River. The Barlow Road, officially the Mount Hood Road, was built in 1846 by Sam Barlow and Philip Foster, with authorization of the Provisional Legislature of Oregon. It was the last overland segment of the Oregon Trail. Before the opening of the Barlow Road, Pioneers traveling by land from the east followed the Oregon Trail to the Dells. Then they floated down the Columbia River to Fort Vancouver. A perilous and expensive journey.
The Barlow Road allowed covered wagons to cross the Cascade Range and reach the Willamette Valley, bypassing the most challenging section of the Columbia River, especially the Celilo Falls and the Cascade Rapids.
Even so, the Barlow Road was by far the most harrowing 100 miles, 160 kilometers, of the nearly 2,000-mile, 3,200 kilometers, Oregon Trail.
The Barlow Road began at the Dalles and ended at Oregon City.
Use of the Oregon Trail declined as the first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869, making the trip west substantially faster, cheaper, and safer.
Today, modern highways such as Interstate Highways 29, 80, and 84 follow parts of the same course westward and pass through towns originally established to serve those using the Oregon Trail.
Oregon City, the end of the Oregon Trail. Dr. John McLaughlin, 1784 to 1857, was a chief factor and superintendent of the Columbia District of the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Vancouver from 1824 to 1845. McLaughlin was a tall, imposing man trained as a physician. He arrived in the area in 1824. When the Northwest Fur Company united with the Hudson's Bay Company, he was put in charge of the Columbia region.
When Fort Vancouver was completed in 1825, McLaughlin made it the headquarters for the entire district. This included all of Oregon Country. Oregon Country was a vast area jointly held by the United States and Great Britain at the time. From here McLaughlin directed the far-flung operations of the fur trade until his resignation in 1846. McLaughlin was known to the Native Americans as the White-Headed Eagle. He dealt strictly but justly with the Native Americans, as witnessed by the fact that there was no serious disturbance in all his territory during more than 20 years of his nominal control. This is a mural in the rotunda of the Oregon State Capitol building showing Dr. John McLaughlin welcoming the first women to cross the continent by covered wagon in 1836.
Although it was in the interests of his fur company to keep the land sparsely populated, McLaughlin sympathized with the early settlers. He treated them generously, allowing missionaries to settle and giving early pioneers the seeds, food, and help they needed after the long, hard trip from the east.
Because of his despair with the failure of Britain to colonize this area, he resigned this position with the Hudson's Bay Company. After the territory became American property, he became an American citizen in 1848 and settled in Oregon City, where he set up a store.
Fort Vancouver became the last stop on the Oregon Trail to buy supplies and land before settlers began their homestead. McLaughlin helped the American emigrants when they reached Oregon.
He was later known as the Preface of Oregon for assisting the American cause in the Oregon Country in the Pacific Northwest. This was despite his orders to keep the American out of the region that was disputed between the Americans and the British.
As a result, McLaughlin was dismissed from his position at Fort Vancouver, and in 1846 he moved to the new settlement of Oregon City on the Willamette River, about 10 miles south of present-day Portland.
Oregon City became famous as the last stop on the Oregon Trail. The only land office in Oregon country was they, and everybody claiming land had to come to Oregon City to file their claims. The McLaughlin set up a general store. The 1957 Oregon State Legislature bestowed upon Dr. John McLaughlin the honorary title of FFA of Oregon in recognition of his significant accomplishments in the early development of the Oregon country.
Oregon City had the first courthouse and land office west of the Rockies, and its location at Willamette Falls provided reliable power for its mills.
In 1846, after McLaughlin left the employ of Hudson's Bay Company, he purchased from the company a land claim located on the Willamette River in Oregon City.
McLaughlin constructed a house and lived there until his death in 1857. The house, a two-style colonial mansion, is typical of East Coast residences from the time.
The McLaughlin House unit of the Fort Vancouver National Historic Site consists of the homes of McLaughlin and Dr. Forbes Barclay, an explorer and associate of McLaughlin's.
The two homes are the McLaughlin House and the Barclay House. They are located adjacent to each other on a bluff overlooking the Willamette River in Oregon City, on a plot of land set aside for public use by McLaughlin in the 1840s. Dr. John McLaughlin retired to the mansion he built in Oregon City, and lived out the rest of his life near the current-day McLaughlin Boulevard, at a spot near the town mills and Willamette Falls.
After McLaughlin's death, the house was almost destroyed. But in 1909, the McLaughlin Memorial Association moved the house up a steep hill to its current location overlooking the town.
The McLaughlin House is in Oregon City, 15 miles south of downtown Portland.
The Oregon Territory stamp was issued on August 14, 1948, on the Oregon Territory Centennial. The vignette shows a wagon on the Oregon Trail.
Pictured hail Dr. McLaughlin and Jason Lee, who are credited with leadership in the provisional government of the Oregon country. The western terminal of the Oregon Trail in Oregon City is commemorated by the end of the Oregon Trail Interpretive Center.
The end of the Oregon Trail Interpretive Center has displays relating to the history of the Oregon Trail and its importance in the settlement of the Pacific Northwest.
The end of the Oregon Trail Interpretive Center is close to the McLaughlin House in Oregon City.
This shows the location of Willamette Falls, the McLaughlin House, and the end of the Oregon Trail Interpretive Center. Oregon City played a significant role in the early history of the Oregon country.
Oregon City was established by Dr. John McLaughlin of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1829 near the confluence of the Clackamas River with the Willamette to take advantage of the power of Willamette Falls to run a lumber mill. During the 1840s and 1850s, Oregon City was the destination for those wanting to file land claims after traveling the Oregon Trail, as the last stop on the trail. Oregon City is the county seat of Clackamas County and is on the Willamette River near the southern limits of the Portland metropolitan area. In 1844, Oregon City became the first U.S. city west of the Rocky Mountains to be incorporated. The present-day city population is 35,000.
Oregon City was the capital of the Oregon Territory from its establishment in 1848 until 1851, and rivaled Portland for early supremacy in the area. In 1846, the Oregon City newspaper, the Oregon Spectator, was the first American newspaper to be published west of the Rocky Mountains.
Willamette Falls is the largest waterfall in the American Pacific Northwest by volume and the 17th widest in the world.
Willamette Falls is the largest waterfall in the American Pacific Northwest by volume and the 17th widest in the world. Horseshoe in shape. It is 1,500 feet, 460 meters, wide and 40 feet, 12 meters, high with a flow of 30,849 cubic feet per second, 874 cubic meters per second, and is located 26 miles, 42 kilometers, upriver from the Willamette's mouth.
The Willamette Falls locks across from Oregon City and West Lynn were the first multi-lift navigational locks in the United States, and are now a National Historic Site. Until 2011, a canal in the locks allowed vessels to pass into the main Willamette Valley. Those locks are now closed. The first long-distance electrical service in the United States originated in Oregon City in 1889, transmitting electricity 14 miles, 23 kilometers, to Portland.
Oregon Territory and Statehood. Astoria is on the Columbia River, about 60 miles west of Portland.
As the Oregon Territory grew and became increasingly more settled, Astoria likewise grew as a port city at the mouth of the Great River that provided the easiest access to the interior. The first U.S. post office west of the Rocky Mountains was established in Astoria in 1847. This is the Oregon Territory, as originally organized in 1848.
In 1853, the northern part of the Oregon Territory was organized as the Washington Territory, which included the present-day state of Washington, the northern third of Idaho, and a small portion of western Montana. When Oregon became a state in 1859, it included only the parts of the original Oregon Territory within the current borders of the state of Oregon.
The state of Oregon, however, did not include all of the previous Oregon Territory. The remaining part was joined to Washington Territory.
In 1859, Oregon became a state.
Washington did not become a state until 30 years later, in 1889.
Recommended videos, Portland. Recommended video, How Oregon Became a State. Recommended video, Oregon, State Profile. Recommended video, Oregon Country, American Expansion in the Pacific Northwest Explained. Recommended video, Oregon Coast Road Trip Vacation Travel Guide, Expedia.
Recommended video, 10 best places to visit in Oregon, travel video.
Recommended video, YouTube navigation. Table of contents, Portland.
Thanks for watching. Please watch some more of my great videos.